Maria Santos never imagined that working the night shift at a small diner near Camp Pendleton would change her life forever. The 34-year-old single mother had been serving coffee and burgers to Marines for 3 years, always with a warm smile despite her own struggles. She knew many of the young soldiers by name, treating them like the sons she never had. It was a cold Tuesday evening in November when everything changed. Maria was wiping down tables when she heard the familiar rumble of military vehicles outside. Through the rain-streaked windows, she watched as a convoy of Marines pulled into the parking lot. Something felt different this time. The soldiers who entered weren't laughing or joking like usual. Their faces were tense, their eyes constantly scanning the room. Sergeant Jake Morrison, a regular customer who always ordered black coffee and apple pie, approached the counter. His usually cheerful demeanor was replaced by something Maria had never seen before: fear. "Maria, we need to talk," Jake whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "There's been a situation. We have reason to believe there might be an attack planned on our convoy tonight. We're not sure when or where, but intelligence suggests it could happen anywhere along our route back to base." Maria's hands trembled as she poured his coffee. She had heard stories on the news about attacks on military personnel, but Camp Pendleton was supposed to be safe. This was American soil, her neighborhood, her workplace. "What kind of attack?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jake's jaw tightened. "We think there's a group planning an ambush. They've been tracking our movements for weeks. Tonight, they might try to hit us when we're most vulnerable, during the drive back through town." Before Maria could respond, the diner door chimed. A group of men entered, their clothing mismatched, their movements deliberate. They weren't Marines. Maria had served enough soldiers to know the difference. These men carried themselves differently, their eyes cold and calculating. One of them, a tall man with a heavy beard, scanned the room before his gaze settled on the Marines. Maria watched as Jake and his fellow soldiers instinctively reached for their weapons, but they were off duty, sitting in a civilian establishment. The rules of engagement were different here. The bearded man approached the counter where Maria stood frozen. "Coffee, please," he said with a thick accent she couldn't place. His smile never reached his eyes. As Maria poured the coffee with shaking hands, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The man's jacket was slightly open, revealing what looked like the handle of a weapon. Behind him, his companions had spread out, positioning themselves strategically around the diner. Jake caught Maria's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the phone behind the counter. He wanted her to call for help, but the men were watching everything. Any sudden movement could trigger a confrontation that would put everyone in danger. Maria's mind raced. There were 6 Marines in the diner, all off duty and relaxed. The strangers numbered 4, but they had clearly planned this encounter. The Marines were sitting, scattered across different tables, while the attackers controlled the exits. "Busy night," the bearded man commented, his eyes never leaving the Marines. "Just the usual," Maria replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Lots of our boys come in after their shifts." The man's smile widened. "Our boys." Maria realized her mistake immediately. She had revealed her connection to the Marines, possibly making herself a target. But there was no taking it back now. The tension in the diner became palpable. The Marines had stopped eating, their hands casually moving closer to their belts where their service weapons would normally be. The attackers shifted position, their intent becoming clearer by the second. Maria knew she had to do something. These young Marines came to her diner because it felt like home, a safe place where they could relax and forget about the dangers they faced. Now that safety was about to be shattered, and it was happening on her watch. Without thinking, Maria grabbed the coffee pot from the warmer. The metal was scalding hot, and she knew it would make an effective weapon if needed. More importantly, it gave her an excuse to move around the diner. "Let me refill everyone's cups," she announced loudly, making sure all the Marines heard her. As she moved from table to table, she whispered urgent warnings. "They're armed," she told Jake. 4 of them, spread out. "I think they're here for you." Jake's eyes widened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Can you get to the phone?" Maria shook her head slightly. "They're watching everything." When she reached the table where Corporal Danny Rodriguez sat with 2 other Marines, she made her decision. Danny was barely 20, with kind eyes that reminded her of her younger brother. He had told her stories about his family back home in Texas, about the girl he planned to marry when his service ended. "Listen carefully," she whispered as she poured his coffee. "In 30 seconds, I'm going to cause a distraction. When I do, you and your friends get behind the counter and call for backup. Don't try to be heroes, just get help." Danny started to protest, but Maria was already moving toward the next table. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but her hands remained steady. The bearded man was watching her carefully now, suspicious of her movements around the diner. His companions had their hands inside their jackets, ready to draw weapons at the first sign of trouble. Maria approached the man's table with the coffee pot held high. "More coffee?" she asked sweetly. As he nodded, Maria made her move. She deliberately stumbled, pouring the scalding coffee directly onto the man's lap and chest. His scream of pain and rage filled the diner as he jumped up, temporarily blinded by the hot liquid. "Run!" Maria shouted to the Marines as chaos erupted around them. But instead of running, the Marines did what they were trained to do. They fought back. Tables overturned as the confrontation exploded into violence. Maria found herself in the center of it all, still clutching the empty coffee pot as a weapon. The bearded man, despite his burns, lunged toward her with murderous intent. Maria raised the coffee pot to defend herself, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. These men had come prepared for war, and she was just a diner waitress who had made them angry. What happened next would change everything. As the man's hand reached for the weapon in his jacket, Maria threw herself forward, not away from the danger, but directly into it. She grabbed his arm with both hands, using all her weight to prevent him from drawing his gun. The impact sent them both crashing into the counter, but Maria held on with desperate strength. She could hear the Marines fighting behind her, shouts and crashes as they battled the other attackers with whatever weapons they could find. The bearded man was much stronger than Maria, and slowly he began to overpower her. His free hand grabbed her throat, squeezing until she could barely breathe. Dark spots danced at the edges of her vision, but still she held on to his gun arm. "You stupid woman," he snarled in her face. "You have no idea what you've done." Maria couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, but she didn't let go. Every second she held him was another second for the Marines to gain the upper hand, another second for help to arrive. Just as her strength was about to fail, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, sirens. Lots of them, getting closer by the second. Someone had managed to call for help. The man heard them too, and his grip on her throat loosened slightly as he looked toward the windows. In that moment of distraction, Maria summoned the last of her strength and brought her knee up hard, connecting with his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping for breath, and Maria finally broke free. She stumbled backward, her throat on fire, just as the first police car screeched to a halt outside the diner. Within minutes, the small restaurant was flooded with law enforcement and military personnel. The 4 attackers were subdued and arrested, though not without a fight. 2 of the Marines had been injured in the struggle, but nothing life-threatening. As the paramedics checked Maria's injuries, bruises on her throat, cuts on her hands from broken dishes, burns from the coffee pot, she watched the Marines giving their statements to the police. They kept looking over at her with expressions of amazement and gratitude. Jake approached her as she sat on the back of an ambulance, an ice pack pressed to her throat. "Maria," he said quietly, "what you did tonight, you saved our lives. If they had gotten the drop on us, if they had been able to draw their weapons first." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew how differently the night could have ended. "I just did what anyone would do," Maria whispered, her voice hoarse from the attack. Jake shook his head. "No, you didn't. You put yourself in harm's way to protect us. You took the blows that were meant for us." As the police finished their investigation and the last of the ambulances pulled away, Maria finally allowed herself to think about what had really happened. For men had come to her diner with the intention of ambushing and possibly killing the Marines who trusted her establishment. Instead, they were now in custody, their plan foiled by a 34-year-old waitress who refused to let harm come to the young soldiers she had grown to care about. The diner was destroyed, tables overturned, dishes broken, windows cracked from the struggle. But everyone was alive, and that was all that mattered. Little did Maria know that her actions that night had been witnessed not just by the local police and the Marines in her diner, but by others who would soon make sure her bravery was properly recognized. The story of the waitress who took on armed attackers to save a group of Marines was about to reach far beyond the small town near Camp Pendleton. As Maria finally drove home that morning, exhausted and sore but alive, she had no idea that her quiet life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. The Marines she had saved that night would not forget what she had done for them, and neither would their commanding officers, or the people they would tell, or the chain of events that was already beginning to unfold. Her act of courage had rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, and those ripples were about to come back to her in the most unexpected way. 3 weeks after the incident at the diner, Maria Santos was trying to return to normal life. The restaurant had been closed for repairs, leaving her temporarily out of work. She spent her days at home with her 8-year-old daughter, Isabella, trying to heal both physically and emotionally from the trauma. The bruises on her throat had faded to yellow, but the nightmares remained. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel the attacker's hands around her neck, see the hatred in his eyes. The local police had told her the 4 men were part of a domestic terrorist cell that had been planning multiple attacks on military personnel. Her actions had potentially saved dozens of lives. Isabella didn't fully understand what had happened that night, only that her mother had been hurt helping some soldiers. The 8-year-old had been staying with her grandmother while Maria worked the night shift, a routine they had followed for years since Maria's husband died in a car accident. Money was becoming a problem. Without her job at the diner, Maria was struggling to pay rent on their small apartment. She had applied for temporary assistance, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and bills didn't wait. She was considering taking a job at a factory on the other side of town, even though it would mean longer hours away from Isabella. On a Thursday morning, as Maria was reviewing want ads at her kitchen table, there was a knock at her door. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a dress military uniform. Her first instinct was fear. Had something happened to one of the Marines from that night? She opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock in place. "Can I help you, Mrs. Santos? My name is Colonel James Mitchell. I'd like to speak with you about the incident at the diner 3 weeks ago." Maria's heart rate increased, but the man's demeanor was calm and respectful. She unlatched the chain and invited him in, noticing how he carefully wiped his feet and removed his hat before entering. Colonel Mitchell was an older man with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but his voice was gentle when he spoke to Isabella, who peeked out from behind her mother's legs. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, settling into the worn armchair Maria offered. "I wanted to meet the woman who saved 6 of my Marines." Maria felt her cheeks flush. "I just did what anyone would have done." The colonel shook his head. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's not true. We've interviewed all the witnesses, reviewed the security footage from the parking lot cameras. You deliberately put yourself in harm's way to protect soldiers you barely knew. That's not something just anyone would do." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and set it on the coffee table. "The men you helped that night have all written statements about your actions. With your permission, I'd like to read you what Sergeant Morrison wrote." Maria nodded, still not sure where this conversation was heading. The colonel cleared his throat and began to read. Maria Santos showed more courage in 5 minutes than many people show in a lifetime. When she realized we were in danger, she didn't run or hide. She put herself between us and armed attackers, knowing she could be killed. She took the violence that was meant for us and turned it into an opportunity for us to survive. Every Marine in that diner owes their life to her actions. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had been so focused on the trauma of that night that she hadn't really considered the impact of her choices. "Mrs. Santos," the colonel continued, "the story of what you did has spread throughout the Corps. When Marines hear about civilians who risk everything to protect them, it means more than you can imagine. It reminds us why we serve and who we're fighting to protect." He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "That's why I'm here today. The Marine Corps, along with several veteran organizations and private donors, would like to do something for you." Maria looked at the papers he handed her, but the legal language was difficult to understand. I don't understand. Colonel Mitchell smiled. Mrs. Santos, a fund has been established in your honor. Marines from bases across the country have contributed, along with their families and veteran groups. The total amount raised is $215,000. Maria stared at him in shock. The number was so large it didn't seem real. There must be some mistake. No mistake. Additionally, the Marine Corps has partnered with a local construction company to completely renovate your apartment building. New windows, updated electrical, fresh paint throughout. Your landlord has agreed to reduce your rent by half for the next 5 years. Isabella, who had been quietly playing with her dolls, looked up at the mention of their home being fixed. Their apartment was old, with windows that didn't close properly and heating that barely worked in winter. But that's not all, the colonel continued. Camp Pendleton's Educational Assistance Program would like to offer Isabella a full scholarship to any college she chooses when the time comes. We believe in investing in the families of heroes. Maria couldn't speak. The generosity was overwhelming, almost impossible to process. For 3 years, she had struggled to make ends meet, working night shifts and missing time with her daughter just to keep their small family afloat. Why? She finally managed to whisper. Why would they do all this for me? Colonel Mitchell leaned forward, his expression serious. Mrs. Santos, do you know what those men planned to do that night? Maria shook her head. She had tried not to think about the details. They had enough weapons and explosives to kill everyone in that diner and several buildings nearby. Their plan was to live stream the attack on social media as recruitment propaganda. Your actions didn't just save 6 Marines. You potentially saved dozens of innocent civilians and prevented a terrorist propaganda victory. The weight of this revelation settled over Maria like a heavy blanket. She had known the situation was dangerous, but she hadn't understood the full scope of what had been prevented. The FBI task force investigating the cell found evidence that this was supposed to be the first of several planned attacks. By disrupting their timeline and getting them arrested, you may have saved hundreds of lives. Isabella had stopped playing and was listening intently, even though she didn't understand everything being said. She moved closer to her mother, sensing the importance of the conversation. There's one more thing, Colonel Mitchell said, reaching into his briefcase again. The Marines you saved that night have a request. They would like to visit you, if you're comfortable with that. They want to thank you properly and meet Isabella. Maria thought about Jake Morrison and Danny Rodriguez, about the other young faces she had served coffee and pie to for 3 years. They had become like family to her, and she had wondered how they were doing since the attack. I would like that, she said quietly. The colonel smiled and stood up. I'll arrange for them to visit this weekend, if that works for you. And Mrs. Santos, there's a ceremony being planned at Camp Pendleton. The commanding general wants to present you with the civilian equivalent of a commendation. It's not required, but the Marines would be honored if you would accept. After the colonel left, Maria sat in her kitchen staring at the papers he had given her. The fund documents, the apartment renovation contracts, Isabella's scholarship paperwork. It all seemed like a dream. Isabella climbed onto her mother's lap, something she still did when she sensed Maria was upset. Mama, are we rich now? Maria hugged her daughter close. No, baby. We're something better than rich. We're blessed. That weekend, the Marines came to visit. Jake Morrison brought flowers, and Danny Rodriguez carried a photo album filled with pictures from their deployment. They spent the afternoon sharing stories, laughing with Isabella, and helping Maria understand the full impact of her actions that night. You know, Jake said as they prepared to leave, before that night, some of us were starting to wonder if people back home really cared about what we do, whether anyone would step up if we needed help. He gestured around Maria's small apartment, where Isabella's artwork covered the refrigerator and family photos lined the mantelpiece. You showed us that there are people worth fighting for. People who fight back when it matters. Danny nodded in agreement. My little sister back home is about Isabella's age. When I think about what could have happened that night, about the kind of world we're trying to protect. He trailed off, emotion thick in his voice. As the Marines left, Maria realized that the money and the renovations and the scholarship were wonderful, but they weren't the most important thing that had come from that terrible night. The most important thing was the connection the understanding that people could still look out for each other when it really mattered. The renovation of the apartment building began the following week. Workers arrived early each morning, transforming the rundown complex into something Maria barely recognized. New windows replaced the drafty old ones, fresh paint covered years of neglect, and modern appliances appeared in every unit. The other tenants in the building were amazed by the changes. Mrs. Chun, an elderly widow who lived next door, knocked on Maria's door one evening with a plate of homemade cookies. "I heard what you did," she said simply. "Thank you for making our home beautiful." Similar expressions of gratitude came from neighbors Maria had barely spoken to before. The renovation had improved everyone's quality of life, and they knew it was because of her actions that night. As the weeks passed, Maria began to understand that her moment of courage had created something much larger than she had ever imagined. The ripple effects continued to spread, touching lives she would never meet, inspiring others to acts of kindness and bravery. Local businesses began reaching out, offering her job opportunities that would provide better hours and more time with Isabella. A nearby community college invited her to speak to their criminal justice students about civilian response to emergency situations. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Maria herself. The woman who had worked quietly in the background, struggling to make ends meet while raising her daughter alone, had discovered reserves of strength and courage she never knew she possessed. Isabella noticed the change too. Her mother stood a little straighter now, spoke with more confidence, and seemed less worried about the future. The scholarship for college was still years away, but just knowing it was there had lifted a weight from Maria's shoulders. The ceremony at Camp Pendleton was scheduled for the following month. Maria had never set foot on a military base before, and the thought of being honored in front of hundreds of Marines was both thrilling and terrifying. But she would be there, she decided. Not just for herself, but for Isabella, who needed to see that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. And for the Marines who had risked their lives to serve their country and deserved to know that someone back home was willing to risk everything to protect them. The ripple effects of that night were far from over. In fact, they were just beginning to reach their ultimate destination, a place where courage would be recognized, gratitude would be expressed, and a small family's life would be changed forever. The morning of the ceremony at Camp Pendleton dawned clear and bright. Maria Santos stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple blue dress she had bought for the occasion. It was the nicest piece of clothing she owned, purchased with some of the fun money after much deliberation about whether she should spend any of it on herself. Isabella bounced excitedly on the bed behind her, wearing a new white dress with a matching hair ribbon. The 8-year-old had been counting down the days since they received the official invitation to the ceremony, barely able to contain her excitement about visiting a real military base. "Mama, will there be tanks?" Isabella asked for the 100th time. "I don't know, baby," Maria replied, smoothing down her daughter's hair. "But there will be lots of Marines, including our friends Jake and Danny." A knock at the door interrupted their preparations. Maria opened it to find Colonel Mitchell in his dress uniform, accompanied by a woman in civilian clothes whom he introduced as Sarah Chun, a Marine Corps public affairs officer. "Good morning, Mrs. Santos," the colonel said with a warm smile. "Are you ready for your big day?" Maria nodded, though her stomach was filled with butterflies. "I think so." Sarah stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Santos, I wanted to prepare you for what to expect today. This ceremony has grown quite a bit since we first planned it. Word of your story has spread beyond the Marine Corps. We have representatives from other military branches attending, local government officials, and several media outlets have requested permission to cover the event." Maria's eyes widened. "Media outlets? Nothing you're not comfortable with," Sarah assured her quickly. "But your story has inspired a lot of people. There are other civilians who have shown similar courage, and they want to meet you. There are military families who want to thank you personally. And there are young people who need to see that heroism isn't just something that happens in movies." The drive to Camp Pendleton took about 30 minutes, during which Isabella pressed her face to the window, marveling at the sight of Marines in training, military vehicles, and the sprawling base that stretched as far as she could see. At the main gate, the guards snapped to attention when they saw Colonel Mitchell's staff car. Maria watched in amazement as they were waved through with sharp salutes and respectful nods. "They know who you are," the colonel explained. "Your story has been shared throughout the base. Every Marine here knows what you did that night." The ceremony was being held in the base's main auditorium, a large building that could seat over 1,000 people. As they pulled up to the entrance, Maria was stunned to see crowds of people filing in, many in uniform, but many others in civilian clothes. "Colonel," Maria said quietly, "I think there's been some mistake. This is much bigger than I expected." Colonel Mitchell turned in his seat to face her. "Mrs. Santos, what you did that night represents something we've been trying to teach people for decades, that freedom isn't just protected by those in uniform, but by ordinary citizens who are willing to stand up when it matters. Today isn't just about honoring you. It's about honoring that principle." Inside the auditorium, Maria was escorted to a seat in the front row. Isabella sat beside her, eyes wide with wonder at the sea of uniforms and flags that surrounded them. The stage was decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, and a large American flag served as the backdrop. As the auditorium filled to capacity, Maria recognized some faces in the crowd. Jake Morrison and Danny Rodriguez were seated with their unit several rows back, both giving her encouraging waves. Mrs. Chun from her apartment building had somehow gotten an invitation and was seated with other community members. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors and the singing of the national anthem. Maria had heard the song countless times before, but sitting in that auditorium surrounded by Marines, many of whom had risked their lives in service to their country, the words carried a weight and meaning she had never felt before. General Patricia Williams, the commanding officer of Camp Pendleton, took the podium to address the crowd. She was an imposing woman with silver hair and countless ribbons on her uniform, but when she smiled at Maria, her expression was warm and maternal. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general began, "we gather today to honor an extraordinary act of courage performed by an ordinary citizen." Maria Santos was working the night shift at a local diner when she witnessed what could have been a devastating terrorist attack on our Marines. Instead of seeking safety for herself, she chose to put her own life at risk to protect others. The general went on to detail the events of that night, explaining to the audience the full scope of what had been prevented by Maria's actions. As she spoke, Maria felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. But instead of feeling uncomfortable, she felt supported, surrounded by people who understood the gravity of what had happened. The terrorists who attacked that night had planned to record their actions and use the footage to recruit others to their cause, General Williams continued. Instead, they found themselves confronted by the courage and determination of an American citizen who refused to let evil triumph. Their propaganda video never existed. Their recruitment tool became a story of American heroism instead. Isabella squeezed her mother's hand tightly as the general called Maria to the stage. Walking up those steps felt like the longest journey of her life. But when she reached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, she saw only support and gratitude. "Mrs. Santos," General Williams said, "by order of the Commandant of the Marine Corps and in recognition of your extraordinary heroism and selfless service to our nation, I present you with the Secretary of Defense Medal for Valor, the highest honor that can be bestowed upon a civilian." As the medal was placed around her neck, the entire auditorium erupted in applause. Marines who had served in combat zones around the world stood and applauded a waitress from a small-town diner who had shown the same courage they displayed on battlefields. But the ceremony was far from over. One by one, representatives from different organizations came forward with their own recognitions. The local sheriff's department presented her with a Citizen's Award for Bravery. The mayor of the city declared it Maria Santos Day and presented her with a key to the city. Military families who had lost loved ones in service came forward to thank her for protecting the Marines who reminded them of their own sons and daughters. The most emotional moment came when Jake Morrison and Danny Rodriguez approached the podium. Jake, normally confident and articulate, seemed to struggle for words. "Mrs. Santos," he began, "the night you saved us, I called my mom when I got back to base. I told her about what happened, about how you put yourself in danger to protect us." She started crying, and she said. Someone's mother loved you boys enough to risk everything for you. That's what you did. You loved us like we were your own children, even though you barely knew us. Danny stepped forward with a folded American flag. This flag was flown over our barracks on the night you saved us. We want you and Isabella to have it. So you'll always remember that your courage is honored not just by us, but by everyone who believes in what America stands for. As Maria accepted the flag, she noticed something else happening in the auditorium. People throughout the crowd were standing, not just applauding but holding up signs and banners. Some read, "Thank you, Maria," and others displayed photos of Marines who had served overseas. But the one that caught her attention was held by a group of young people near the back. "Heroes live among us." When the formal ceremony concluded, Maria was invited to a reception where she could meet with the attendees personally. For the next 2 hours, she shook hands and received hugs from an endless stream of people who wanted to thank her. A Vietnam veteran with tears in his eyes told her that her story had restored his faith in the American people. A military wife whose husband was deployed overseas said that knowing there were people like Maria at home made the separation easier to bear. A group of high school students asked for her autograph and told her they were inspired to volunteer in their community. But perhaps the most meaningful encounter came near the end of the reception, when an elderly woman in a wheelchair approached her. The woman wore a pin indicating she was the mother of a fallen soldier. "My son died in Afghanistan 3 years ago," she said quietly. "Sometimes I wondered if his sacrifice meant anything, if people back home really cared about our military families." She reached out and took Maria's hand. "What you did that night, the way you protected those boys like they were your own, it helps me believe that my son's sacrifice wasn't in vain, that there are people worth fighting for." As the day came to an end and Maria and Isabella prepared to leave Camp Pendleton, Colonel Mitchell walked them to their car. Isabella was carrying a stuffed eagle mascot that had been given to her by the Marine Corps band, and her pockets were full of challenge coins from various units. "Mrs. Santos," the colonel said, "I hope you understand the impact you've had, not just on the Marines you saved that night, but on everyone who has heard your story. You've reminded us all that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear when something bigger than yourself is at stake." As they drove away from the base, Isabella chattered excitedly about everything she had seen and done. But Maria was quiet, processing the overwhelming emotions of the day. Over the following weeks, the impact of the ceremony continued to ripple outward. The local news coverage led to national attention, and Maria found herself receiving letters from across the country. Military families sent photos and stories of their own sacrifices. Young people wrote about being inspired to serve others. Community leaders invited her to speak about civic responsibility and courage. The diner where the incident had occurred was renovated and reopened, with a small plaque by the entrance commemorating the events of that night. Maria returned to work there, but her role had changed. She was no longer just a waitress. She had become a symbol of the connection between military and civilian communities. Regular customers would stop by just to shake her hand and thank her. New customers came from hours away, having heard her story and wanting to meet the woman who had taken on terrorists to save Marines. The diner's walls became covered with photos and letters from military units around the world. But perhaps the most significant change was in the way Maria saw herself and her place in the world. The quiet woman who had struggled to make ends meet while raising her daughter alone had discovered that she was capable of extraordinary things. More importantly, she had learned that ordinary people doing their jobs with love and dedication could make an extraordinary difference. Isabella, too, was changed by the experience. She walked taller at school, proud of her mother's courage, but also understanding that heroism was something that lived inside regular people, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. Months later, as Maria tucked Isabella into bed in their newly renovated apartment, her daughter asked the question that had been on her mind since the ceremony. "Mama, would you do it again? If you had to choose between being safe and protecting the Marines, would you make the same choice?" Maria smoothed the covers and smiled at her daughter. "I hope I never have to find out, baby. But if I did, I hope I would have the same courage as before. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when you're scared." As Isabella drifted off to sleep, Maria looked out the window at the lights of Camp Pendleton in the distance. Somewhere on that base, young Marines were standing guard, protecting their country and the freedoms she and Isabella enjoyed every day. She had taken the blows meant for a troop of Marines one terrifying night, and they had come to her home. Not just the 6 she had saved, but hundreds of their brothers and sisters in arms, along with a community that recognized the value of her sacrifice. The circle was complete, but the story would continue. Every time someone heard about the waitress who fought terrorists to save Marines, every time a young person was inspired to serve others, every time a civilian and a service member looked at each other with mutual respect and understanding, Maria's moment of courage would live on. She had learned that heroes weren't people with special powers or perfect lives. Heroes were ordinary people who chose to do the right thing when it mattered most, regardless of the cost to themselves. And in a world that sometimes seemed divided, Maria Santos had become a bridge between military and civilian communities, proving that when freedom was threatened, Americans would stand together and fight back, no matter what uniform they wore or what job they held. The Marines had come to her home, not as strangers, but as family. And that made all the difference.